And start by welcoming people to the KSC 199 Faculty Student Scholarship Seminar. I think it's number 11 of 13. We have 2 more to go. Tonight's presentation is by Tim Hastings. He's a graduate student here at Keene State in the program of History and Archives. To introduce Tim, we have Professor Greg Knopf, Professor of History and Assistant Dean for the School of Arts, Education, and Humanities. I'm going to sign off and give it over to Greg and join Greg and Tim after the program.
All right, thank you, Mike. And it's my great pleasure to introduce Tim Hastings, a student in the History Masters in History and Archives. Tim has a far-ranging intellect and a lot of different abilities. He is a Keene State undergraduate graduate, cum laude, from 2013 in biology. He's continued on in that field in his career. After he graduated in 2013, he worked at the Joslin Diabetes Center as a research assistant in the Department of Genetics and Epidemiology down in Boston from 2013 to 2018. He's also currently working in the Department of Biological Sciences here at Keene State as a lab tech. I know from talking to my valued colleagues in biology just how important Tim is to making those labs run. He's actually published in the field of biology, numerous jointly authored papers, so he already comes with those credentials. Tim was interested in history, and he kind of took on an entirely different way of thinking about the world and was, pun intended, a member of the charter generation of our first group of graduate students when we opened up our 4+1 and standalone Master's in History and Archives. And Tim has definitely made the right decision. He's listened to my propaganda about how the most interesting period in the world is the early modern period. And he is focusing on the history of the Atlantic world and early America. And tonight he's going to be talking, he's going to give us an overview of what his thesis, which he very soon will be defending, up his master's degree on, and this is his overarching topic on. He's going to give us a short presentation on that, getting away with murder, violence in the construction of race in 18th century New Hampshire. He's going to talk about the development of racism and how state-sponsored and sanctioned violence helped construct those racial categories. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Tim Hastings. So Tim, tell us all about your work.
Alrighty. Thank you, Professor Knopf, and thanks everyone for joining me tonight. It's a privilege to be able to share my all the research I've done with you guys. So I'm just going to jump right into things for the sake of time. All right, so this here is a broadside, and I apologize for the image. It's a little shiny because it was in protected plastic. Excuse me. And it's about the execution of a man named Thomas Powers. And here in bold letters, it says the last words and dying speech of Thomas Powers, a mulatto man who is to be executed this day in July 1796 for a rape committed in Lebanon in the state of New Hampshire. In the broadside, Thomas Powers gives a narrative of his life, a brief autobiography. It includes a lot of petty crime, but also numerous sexual crimes. And he does ultimately confess to the rape that he's ultimately hanged for. And he does ask for forgiveness. So when I first came across this, I was intrigued by it because I never read or heard anything about something like this happening in New Hampshire. Violence against Black men for sexual crimes against white women is not at all unfamiliar to us. But it's typically associated with the antebellum South and maybe the Jim Crow South. So I had to know more about this case and this person. So at first I wanted to try to uncover any information I could about Thomas Powers and maybe ultimately examine the lives of other Black people in New Hampshire. But all I had to go on really was this broadside and some other court documents. And the provenance of the narrative was a little bit hard to pin down, so I really had no information about his life. So then it raised the question of, well, why did this particular crime by this particular individual warrant a published broadside that said in bold letters, his race, and the crime that he was to be hanged for. So it seemed that the best way to get the answers to these questions would be to analyze New Hampshire's power structure and figure out how his death was used by the state. So the big overarching question was, what was the purpose of this spectacular violence, of this public hanging, and why was it widely published? So like I said, violence upon a Black body is not at all unfamiliar to us. But again, we associate a lot of the times with the antebellum South. So it's surprising that his execution happened in New Hampshire only a decade or so after the Revolution. And there's a tendency to characterize racism and slavery as Southern issues, but this tends to erase the history of Black and Indigenous people and rewrites it as a history of white men. But New Hampshire did have its own experience with racial violence, slavery, and white supremacy. And that's what I'm going to get into tonight. So here's an outline of my talk. I'm going to start by examining slavery in the Atlantic world. And when I say the Atlantic world, I mean the transatlantic world of North America, Europe, Africa, South America, and the Caribbean during the 1500s through maybe the early 1800s. And I'm going to do this in order to give background on the origins of Atlantic slavery and to demonstrate that it didn't just emerge in, say, 1830 South Carolina. Then I'll discuss New Hampshire's place in that Atlantic world, and I'll examine both Native and African slavery in New Hampshire. Then I'll talk about how slavery eventually contributed to a racialized social hierarchy in New Hampshire, and it led to concepts of people of color as criminal and potentially dangerous, and the basis of whiteness began to be defined in relation to enslaved people of color. Then I'll talk about how toward the middle of the 1700s, African slavery began to supplement and then eventually become more important than native slavery. And this was occurring at the same time that there was an increase in violent conflicts between Native Americans and European imperial powers. And there was also an increase in expansion of European colonists into native territory. And at this point, natives seemed outside the bounds of slavery and of colonial power structures. So the resistance to colonization led to both popular and state-sanctioned racialized violence against them. And this led to a common white identity, which was constructed in relation to this native other. Then I'll move into the Revolution, where people of color were viewed as British allies and potentially dangerous. And they were excluded from the emerging national identity, and they were viewed as racial others. And then I'll finish up by discussing the end of the 18th century and talk about how as abolition became more widespread in New England and New Hampshire, a population of free Blacks emerged. And the basis of whiteness began to shift from this system of racialized slavery to a fully racialized system of a white supremacy by the end of the 18th century. So at this point, people of color were in effect separate and unequal. And my overarching argument for this presentation, at least, is in how I ultimately used the broadside and the accompanying court documents about Thomas Powers. I'm going to argue that Thomas Powers' execution is the performance of the new racialized social order, and it used the spectacular violence, his public hanging, in order to criminalize the bodies of people of color and to demonstrate the consequences of threatening the privileges of whiteness. So if I were to ask you what you thought about when imagining slavery, I don't doubt that many people would say cotton or plantation or really anything we associate with the antebellum South. So something like this image would probably pop to mind. And that's not at all surprising. But slavery didn't emerge as a 19th century Southern or phenomenon in the North American South. It was a historical process and it occurred throughout the Atlantic world. And it had already existed for almost 4 centuries by the time of the Civil War. So next, I'm going to give a brief overview of Atlantic slavery and then examine New Hampshire's place within that Atlantic slave system. I just want to give everybody a good idea of what type of place the colonial Atlantic was and what type of system this system of slavery was. So Atlantic slavery was initiated by the Portuguese and the Spanish in the late 1400s. They took advantage of demographic collapses of native populations in places like Central America and the Caribbean, and they imposed European rule. And the collapse is due largely to disease, as I'm sure most people know, but there was also the slavery and brutal violence and everything else that goes along with colonialism played a huge role in this demographic collapse. And it's important to know here that it was actually indigenous people who made up the bulk of the first enslaved people. So in this 50-year period between the late 1400s and around 1540, the Portuguese and Spanish had enslaved around 1 million Native Americans in this 50-year period. In that, to put it into some sort of perspective, in that same period, around maybe 100,000 Africans have been enslaved, and that's still a large number. But the bulk of enslaved people in the very early period of Atlantic slavery were indigenous, and I think that's important to highlight. People did continue to be imported to the Americas in increasing numbers, and there was an increase in demand for labor in general. And this included the continued forced transportation of Native Americans from New England, and I will talk more about that in a moment. But you really see the biggest increase in enslaved Africans in particular during the Sugar Revolution, which took place at the end of the 17th century and into the 18th century. The process of producing sugar was being improved around this time, and it required a lot of work, but also generated a lot of wealth for European nations, in particular England and France. But being an enslaved person on one of these plantations was almost a death sentence. So to put this into a little bit of perspective and give some numbers, in this 30-year period here between 1708 and 1735, the Black population of Barbados, which was an English island in the Caribbean, which was had a lot of sugar plantations, the Black population went from 42,000 to 46,000, so a net increase of 4,000. But in that same period, 85,000 enslaved people had been imported. So you only have a net increase of 4,000 people in spite of 85,000 having been imported. So it was incredibly deadly and brutal. And the bodies of Africans were quite literally disposable. Besides the sheer brutality of it, it was also racialized. And also it was self-perpetuating. So the children of enslaved Black and Indigenous women, they were born enslaved. So in effect, enslavers appropriated both labor and the reproductivity of enslaved women. So this graph right here, this shows the early stages that it was kind of a small amount of enslaved Africans being shipped at first, but then around here, around the Sugar Revolution, you can see it increased almost exponentially, and it continues to be high throughout the 19th century. And I like this image a lot. Again, it's just the of enslaved African people, the forced movement of them. But in this 200-year period, up to between 10 and 15 million enslaved Africans were transported to the Americas. And if you look, the vast majority were shipped to Brazil and the West Indies, and this was because of the numerous sugar plantations there. So it required a lot of labor. And as I mentioned above, New England, including New Hampshire, wasn't isolated from this system of Atlantic enslavement. The English had conducted many wars against Native Americans during the 1600s, in particular the Pequot War in the 1630s and King Philip's War in the 1670s, generated a lot of enslaved natives. And the English realized that there was a market for enslaved people. So they sold their enslaved Native Americans in the English West Indies and purchased enslaved Africans in the Caribbean, and they sold them in New England. But they did also keep native slaves in their household. So there was this interesting hybrid society forming in the 1640s or in the 1600s. New Hampshire was fully integrated in the Atlantic economy by this point. Merchants from the coast, they exported lumber and fish to the West Indies, and they fed the expanding enslaved African population. And by 1650 or so, Portsmouth was the hub of the mass trade, and would remain so for a century or so. And this isn't particularly important because the mass trade was really critical, not just for the production of merchant ships, but for ships in the Royal Navy. And this is important because the Royal Navy and the British military more generally were responsible for controlling the slave populations in the West Indies. So New Hampshire was fully integrated and a part of this system of subjugation. It was also largely governed by Massachusetts Bay in around 1641. And interestingly, the first statute regulating slavery was not written in England or in the Anglo-Caribbean, somewhere like Barbados, but in Massachusetts. Slavery didn't actually exist in English law. It was a product of the colonies. So this first law, the Body of Liberties, it was written primarily to regulate native slavery, but it did obviously have implications for African slavery as well. It legalized the enslavement of captives taken during a just war, so something like the Pequot War, King Philip's War. And it also didn't protect natives from enslavement who converted to Christianity. So there was less of a cultural association with race here, or with enslavement. It was becoming racialized. In the Body of Liberties as well, there was a section about legalizing the enslavement of quote unquote strangers who were sold to the colony. And this made Africans particularly vulnerable to enslavement because they were the ones who had been being sold into the colonies, like I mentioned, from the Caribbean or West Indies up to New England. So this law created the possibility for both racial and chattel slavery, and it laid the foundation for other slave laws. Again, this happened in Massachusetts and not, say, Barbados or in mainland England. So New Hampshire was part of the system that was at the forefront of legalizing and pushing the Atlantic slave trade. And because of slavery, we begin to see a social hierarchy organized around race and not just class. And it's notable that in New Hampshire, this began due to native slavery as opposed to African slavery. But native slavery did affect attitudes towards enslaved Africans as well. And we know that there were enslaved Africans in New Hampshire since 1645. The first reports of them were on this ship called the Rainbow, which was captained by a man from Massachusetts who was a trader. And when he was along the coast of Africa, he illegally enslaved two men and brought them back to New England, where he sold one of them to the lieutenant governor of New Hampshire. A Massachusetts court ultimately did rule that the men had to be freed because they were illegally enslaved in Africa. And this was a violation of that 1641 law that I mentioned. But it does demonstrate that New Hampshire's involvement in Atlantic slavery was there from the beginning, in that there was an increasingly blurry line between free and unfree for people of color. And this is very important in the colonial Atlantic because a free person of color could easily become enslaved very quickly. But it was more towards the end of the 1600s that New Hampshire saw an increase in enslaved Africans. But either way, there was still this fear that people of color were untrustworthy and they were potentially destabilizing to society. So because of this, in the early 1700s, there were laws passed that sought to control the behavior of people of color, whether free or enslaved. This included curfews, preventing them from setting up businesses or trading, which crippled them economically. And all of the consequences of this, they all included violent punishments. So in effect, these laws lumped people of color together into one category of criminal. Importantly, in Britain, during the same time, the first couple decades of the 1700s, they passed laws that severely punished crimes against property And in effect, they were criminalizing the poor. Notably, the Waltham Black Acts in the 1720s. These laws made things like poaching punishable by execution. And all of this was done to protect property in the interests of the elites. It was a society based around class. And they used or threatened to use spectacular violence like public hangings in order to enforce these laws against the poor and the unpropertied. In New Hampshire, we see a similar thing happening, but race is entering into the equation. The government and citizens felt that both free and enslaved people of color represent a threat to the emerging racialized social hierarchy, and these laws reflect it. And eventually this would lead to an association between people of color, slavery, and criminality. And this will have very important implications for my analysis of Thomas Power's execution later on. One last thing that I'd like to note here is what was happening that differentiated the enslavement of people of color from, say, white indentured servitude. Enslaved natives and Africans were considered property. They were bequeathed in people's wills throughout the 1700s, and they were counted among a person's estate in much the same way that something like livestock were. This did not happen with white indentured servants. So here you begin to see whiteness being defined in relation to a race-based system of slavery. So there was a general increase in African slavery in New Hampshire during the 1700s, and it began to be more important than native slavery. So between around 1700 and 1750, the numbers went from about 130 to 550 enslaved Africans. And while the numbers seem small, what's important here is that there were laws on the books that controlled and criminalized both Africans and natives. And this suggests that, as I mentioned, that racialization was occurring. In focusing on these small numbers, this is how race kind of slips off the Northern New England historical radar. So race was important, so don't let the numbers fool you. But at the same time that these numbers of enslaved Africans was going up, there were larger conflicts between European imperial powers and Native American groups. And this usually involved Native groups allying with whichever power best served their own interests. At the same time, there was both state-sanctioned violence and the incentivization of racial violence. So for example, in King George's War, which took place in the 1740s, there were scalp bounties in New Hampshire. So the New Hampshire legislature would provide money for the scalping, killing, or kidnapping of native men, women, and children. And there was a long list of native groups that fell under this statute. And this included their allies and even people who the English weren't at war with. So in effect, the New Hampshire's legislature incentivized the indiscriminate killing of natives. At the same time, many native groups seemed to strike at the towns of frontier colonists almost with impunity, and this caused a sense of fear and helplessness in these groups. And this collective suffering, it contributed to a sense of unity among these frontier colonists, and many of these frontier colonists were not ethnically English, and they might have been Scots-Irish or maybe even German, and non-English were viewed as kind of, especially Scots-Irish, were viewed as inferior to some degree. But the unity that they felt in the face of this violence, coupled with the racialized hatred, it contributed to a construction of a common white identity out of this heterogeneous white population. And eventually this hate and fear would boil over, and it would lead to the killing of 2 Abenakis during peacetime, which caused a lot of trouble in New Hampshire's government. So this was one of the main archival sources that I analyzed. I came across it when looking at some digitized copies of Meshach Ware's papers here at Keene State. And I also got documents from the New Hampshire State Archives and from some published collections. to piece the story together. And this is just the original document here that I found digitized at Keene State, and I just highlighted or circled the two Abenakis who were killed. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time on this just because it's important, and I'll give you a brief overview of the case. So two Abenakis named Sabatis and Christo from the Canadian mission village of St. Francis. They stole, which is near Quebec. They stole two enslaved African men, named Tom and Pierre, from a farm in Canterbury, New Hampshire in May of 1752. And they sold both enslaved men to the French in New York, but one of the enslaved men named Tom, he escaped and returned to his enslavers in in Canterbury. And he was able to actually identify Sabatis because he had been known in the Canterbury area and had actually been friendly with some families there. A year later, Sabatis and another Abenaki named Plazaway returned to Kentucky, New Hampshire, which was not far southwest of Canterbury. They returned there to hunt. And while they were there, a man named Anthony Bowen apparently recognized Sabatis and invited him and Plazaway to his house, where he got them both drunk and forced Sabatis to confess to stealing Tom and Pierre. Bowen ultimately murdered them, both of the men, in retribution for this theft. For almost another year, the murderers went unpunished, and there was eventually a lot of pressure on Governor Benning Wentworth to bring them to justice. He was getting letters from all sides, from the governor of Massachusetts, Governor Shirley, and the royal government, including Lord Halifax, who was the president of the Board of Trade, which oversaw colonial commerce. He wrote to Wentworth and told him that because of these murders, a war with Native Americans had started, and he better bring them to justice, or else there'll be a lot of trouble. And normally Wentworth was quite good at balancing royal orders and popular politics. So this is particularly jarring for both him and the rest of the government. So ultimately, Bowen and an accomplice named John Morrill were arrested in the spring of 1754, and they were imprisoned. But while they were awaiting trial, a mob broke them out of prison. They were never recaptured, and according to one source, they lived the rest of their lives in the Kentucky area. So just as an aside, in case anyone was wondering, none of the records actually indicate what John Morrill's role was in the killing. It's mentioned that Bowen was with one or two other people when he killed Sabatis and Plazaway, so it's possible that Morrill was one of these unnamed individuals. So there are a number of things going on here. I'm not going to get into all of them, or else we'll be here all night. So I'm just going to point out some of the most important. It revolves around the theft of property. And by that, I mean the enslaved African men. And they were stolen from white European colonists. So Bowen was apparently seeking justice for this theft. But it was also an instance of racist violence and hatred toward Native Americans. So for example, Plazaway had not even been involved in the theft, but he was still killed. And this indicates that violence could be inflicted upon natives for perceived crimes, whether they were guilty or innocent, and that colonists were beginning to view natives as a single category. So Bowen and Morrill were attempting to protect this, the perceived rights of the protection of property, but also their racial and class privileges. But it was also popular racial violence and not state-sanctioned violence like we saw with the scalp bounties. The murders occurred when there was no declared war, so it didn't have the blessing of the government, and it wasn't protected by the law. And finally, you see the fear that the government had at the escape of the prisoners, and in particular the mob violence. And this shows that there were still class tensions among white Europeans in the province. But this type of violence against natives, the murders, it helps create a common white identity out of this mixture of European people. And it was an identity constructed in opposition to that of the native other. And it was used to protect the privileges of this emerging common white identity. So there were similar instances of racial and genocidal violence in other parts of the colonies throughout the mid-18th century. Pennsylvania is particularly well documented. There's been a lot written about the Paxton Boys Massacre, for example, and that's what I have depicted here. They conducted a series of genocidal murders outside of Philadelphia. But New Hampshire isn't well documented. And that's why I wanted to emphasize these murders so much. And the evidence actually does suggest that it began a bit earlier, almost a decade earlier in New Hampshire than in Pennsylvania. So as you can see from these murders, there were still class issues between frontier whites and the provincial government and some tensions. But these issues began to be resolved by the merging of this popular violence that we saw in the murders, but then also the state-sponsored killings, which we saw in the scalp laws. And a raid on the village of St. Francis during the 7 Years' War, or the French and Indian Wars, is evidence of this merging. So I'm not going to get into this as much as the previous bit, but because we don't have as much time. But it was conducted by Major Robert Rogers in 1759, and Rogers grew up in New Hampshire and was the son of Scots-Irish immigrants. He and his men, during this raid, they destroyed much of the village and indiscriminately killed Abenaki men, women, and children. And incidentally, this was the village where Sabatus and Plosway were from. They conducted this raid supposedly in retribution for some English soldiers who were killed by a group of men who allegedly came from this village, but it can't be verified. But this violence demonstrated that racial and genocidal violence had become part of official English policy. And you see the merging of this popular racial violence and state-sanctioned racial violence. The person who actually ordered the attack was Sir General Geoffrey Amherst, and you probably know him better as the Englishman who ordered that smallpox-infected blankets be given to natives during Pontiac's War in a form of biological warfare. So this raid shows that this was a signal that resistance to the British would or could result in racial violence and genocide. And this is important because genocidal violence against Native Americans continued through this time period, through the Revolution and long after. And in the Revolution, you still see this need to appease frontier whites, like we saw in the case of Sabatus and Plosway's murder. And it was key to get their support. Land had been a big issue leading up to the Revolution. It was a big grievance. The Proclamation of 1763, the Crown decreed that land west of the Appalachian Mountains would be native territory, and frontier colonists, they couldn't expand in that land. So this was a huge issue. So during the Revolution, in order for the revolutionaries to conduct their war, they had to respond to frontier colonists' need for land and protection against natives, or else they risked alienating them and driving them to the British. So in order to achieve this, they offered military support, and this included conducting racial violence and sometimes genocide against Native peoples. And in effect, the government linked American nationalism with racial and genocidal violence. But after having the support of these frontier whites, they began to define Americans in relation to the British in order to further consolidate their support. This began to make identity more exclusive. So they drew on other groups of people in their societies that they perceived to be problematic and potentially dangerous. Native Americans and African Americans were good choices for this because, as we've seen, they were already deemed untrustworthy and dangerous. This fear wasn't manufactured out of whole cloth because in 1775, the royal governor of Virginia, Lord Dunmore, he issued a proclamation that said that if enslaved blacks fought for the crown, that they would get their freedom. So tens of thousands did end up fighting for the British against their former enslavers. So there was a little bit of reality to that. There were also other ways that people of color were excluded from national identity. And the association test is another example, which I have part of it shown here. And this involved being excluded from civic responsibilities, like the militia. So with the association test, people in the towns, men had to sign to avow their loyalty to the revolutionary cause. But accepted from this were, as I've circled here, lunatics, idiots, and Negroes. In the document, it says that they, quote, wish to show their determination in joining their American brethren in defending the lives, liberties, and properties of the inhabitants of the United Colonies. So this language implies that by signing, the person is laying claim to an American identity. But as you see, it excludes people of African descent, regardless of their status as free or unfree. And it singles them out as being outside the bounds of this identity. It also, as you probably noticed, it doesn't mention Native Americans at all. And this implies that they were already considered outside the bounds of this identity. And it might be because they were considered uncontrollable, and also that they were outside the system of slavery. So they're outside the power structures. And finally, you don't see the term white here. And this implies that by this time, it was already assumed that only white males could obtain the privileges of being part of this American identity. So whiteness had become synonymous with citizenship and freedom. So during the 1770s and through to the early 1800s, there was a sharp decline and near disappearance of slavery from New Hampshire and other parts of New England. But it's important to note that abolition did not mean racial equality. So the census returns, they indicate that this drop in slavery, a huge drop from its height in 1775 to almost no slaves by 1800. But in spite of these numbers, there was still debate about the status of slavery. And there were questions around, asking if the New Hampshire's Constitution freed these slaves, because in Article 1, which was established in 1783, it said that, quote, all men are born free and independent. But just a year later, in 1784, enslaved Black people were still rated as, or were still taxed as property. And to complicate a little more, in 1788, Justice Simeon Alcott, who was part of the New Hampshire Supreme Court, when he was asked about it, he responded that he thought that slavery was still legal, so was the interstate slave trade, and he explicitly said that the state constitution did not legalize abolition. Incidentally, Simeon Alcott, he would be the judge in Thomas Power's case. And I'll talk more about that in a moment. But either way, formerly enslaved people were economically vulnerable. They had very low-paying jobs, and some whites actually just viewed them as replacements for their former slaves. And there was a continued association between Blackness and servitude, which would continue throughout even to the 19th century. And there was fear of the immigration of free Blacks into many places in this area. And they were afraid that they would be stealing the jobs of white people. In the 1790s, many local governments and citizens, they attempted to prevent the immigration of free people of color. And this sentiment is reflected in this New Hampshire Gazette article that I have here. It was published in 1790, and it asks, quote, why the inhabitants of the town of Portsmouth do not put to vote the question for the keeping out of Negroes from this town. And he goes on to accuse them of being both dangerous and of taking the work out of white people's hands. So this demonstrates that slavery and the association of people of color with criminality had become fully embedded in New Hampshire's society and culture. And by making this such a critical issue, it indicates that race was really important to the development of the new state. and that New Hampshire did have its own experience with race. And this article also suggests that in post-slavery New Hampshire, the basis of whiteness had shifted again, and it shifted from this racialized slavery to a system of white supremacy where racial categories were fully established. So by this time, race had become the most important organizing principle of New Hampshire's social hierarchy, and it was critical to protect it from this small population of people of color. So I'm just going to finish up here by talking about how Thomas Powers, his execution, his public execution, was the performance of this new racialized social order. So if we remember, he was executed for the crime of rape, and they published a broadside that listed his race and the crime, and he allegedly committed or confessed the crime. So the criminalization and the violence toward Thomas Powers and the Black body more generally, it reinforces this new racialized social order. There aren't any surviving records of the evidence that was used against him in court. So all the info we have is from this confession and a couple of newspaper articles, and they're very questionable. And the evidence actually does suggest that he was illiterate, which kind of calls into question his ability to write that narrative. But either way, the provenance of the narrative isn't important. It's important that it lists his race and that he committed rape. And this crime is important because it demonstrates both the disparate treatment under the law, and also that sexuality had become racialized. And this was creating ideas of difference between blackness and whiteness. So, for example, not everyone accused of rape was treated equally under the law. Black men, whether free or enslaved, were the majority of individuals convicted of and executed for it between 1700 and 1820. And it was overwhelmingly for sexual crimes against white women. There's also less need of it, or less need of proof in court, rather. And the testimonies against Black defendants were often formulaic. So a common one was the assertion that the man had pulled the woman from her horse and, quote, ravaged her. And this is actually almost the exact wording used in both narrative or Powers' narrative and in several newspapers that reported alleged details of the incident. Also, Black on white sex crimes were viewed as an act of rebellion against the social order. And finally, the concept of the Black male as a sexual predator was a projection of the widespread white male sexual assaults of Black women. And many of these Black women were enslaved, so they could not consent. This was racialized sexuality, and it contributed to the idea that the Black population was dangerous and they needed to be controlled. So the sexual nature of Thomas Powers' crime, and that it was widely published, it reinforced the idea that Black and white crime was pervasive and a threat to this racialized social order, and that it would need to be punished with spectacular violence in order to protect this and to deter future infringement on it. You can also see that white supremacy was embedded in the justice system. So as I mentioned above, Simeon Alcott, he mentioned that his opinion was that slavery was still legal. He was the judge in Powers' case. In his opinion, slavery almost certainly influenced the way that he viewed Powers and other people of color. Powers was Black, and therefore he was a threat. And this warranted state-sponsored violence. And his Powers' death also demonstrates that racial violence, it was transferable between natives and people of color. So we saw it done on natives in the murders of Sabatus and Plausiway, the raid on St. Francis, and we've also seen it in many instances of genocidal violence since. And it's mainly used to protect the racialized social hierarchy and racial privileges. And critically, here, his execution was the representation of the melding of British concepts of justice and American racist ideology. So, as I said much earlier, they criminalized the poor and punished those who committed property crimes in order to protect their class-based social order, while Thomas Powers was executed in order to protect this white supremacist social order. So this completed the transfer of inherent criminality from the unpropertied or poor in Britain to this racial other in the United States. And finally, I just briefly want to reflect on the way that sources shape what we can know kind of about history and how the case of Thomas Powers illustrates this. So information contained in the archive, it reflects the system of power that was in place during the creation and maintenance of the records. And because of this, it constrains the way that marginalized groups emerge out of the archival record. In this case, we end up concluding that Northern New England was a white part of a white republic where people of color had no history, and this is highly problematic, and it's also untrue, as I hope I've been able to demonstrate that New Hampshire did have its own experience with slavery, racism, and white supremacy. So the way that Thomas Powers emerges from the archive, it reflects his position in this white supremacist social hierarchy. He was Black and therefore a criminal who needed to be controlled. And his execution was a reminder of what would happen to those who threatened the privileges of whiteness. And just before I open it up to questions, I have a question, or I want to address something that might be in the back of people's minds, and that's, what if Thomas Powers had it? What if he was actually guilty? What if he had committed the crime? And we simply can't know that because the evidence isn't there for us to scrutinize. But either way, his innocence or guilt doesn't really matter here, because what I'm investigating is the power structure of New Hampshire and what purpose is death served within that power structure. So even if he was guilty, his hanging, it was still a form of spectacular violence that, demonstrated and reinforced what would happen to somebody a person of color who threatened the racialized social hierarchy. And also, if he were actually guilty, the outcome still would have been the same, but it could have been used to further, fuel the point, or to fuel the idea that all Blacks and people of color were inherently dangerous and threatened the white population. So his guilt or innocence was unimportant in this case. All right, now I think we're opening up to questions.
And yep, I've unmuted
I was going to say,
myself.
this is usually when Mike says that if you could hear us, you would hear some applause. Thank you for an excellent presentation. Go ahead, Mike.
I'll say, yep. So Greg, do you have questions that you want to,
Yeah.
be advisor?
Well,
you
I
can
see
jump right
that
in.
there are some in the Q&A, and I'll try to field them as well as I can. The first is from one of the attendees, and this is perfect, Tim, because you foresaw this question. The question was, I wonder about the truth of the accusation of rape against Thomas Powers. Did you have any sense that it was not truthful and was covering up a white man's commitment of the crime? So you kind of answered that, but I'll give you the opportunity to respond more fully to that.
Well, yeah, that just speaks to the kind of the projection of this of the widespread sexual assaults of Black women at the hands of white men, normally due to the enslaved status, or just the inability for these people to advocate for themselves because of fear of punishment, or because of the unequal power relations. So I can't say for certain whether or not Thomas Powers was guilty or not. My hunch is, I honestly don't know, and I can't completely commit to that.
And Wes Martin had a question about the role of Lockean justifications for just war and the influence of Massachusetts slave law. I'll let Wes go ahead and ask it since he's a participant.
That was a wonderful presentation. Thank you very much. And I wrote my query very early into the presentation. I'm used to thinking of European ideas as traveling one way, and I tend not to think about American ideas as returning back to the continent, where we would then digest them after they had been presented back to us again. John Locke is a case in point, who ends up writing the constitutions of Carolina in 1669, a full 19 years before he writes the treatises, first and second treatises of government, which we lay claim to as Americans as the basis for at least our Declaration of Independence. And here you're citing something I've never encountered before. I know too little about American history. The 1641 Massachusetts Body of Liberties. And it appears to provide a just war justification for enslavement, which is eerily similar to that provided by Locke 20 years later and 20 years after that in the Constitutions of the Carolina and in the Second Treatise of Government, where Locke, and this is my really grim gloss on his writing, says that slavery is justified because the slaves, well, they lost a just war. And they're not quite dead, but they've lost their rights as living people. You've done a lot of work on this. Are you aware of a connection between the two? Because while you were talking, I was multitasking and I couldn't find a connection.
Right.
And Laslet's notes don't say anything about it, and none of the other commentaries do.
I'm not completely sure about specifically Lockean ideas in there. I do know that part of it was that they needed to be able to actually justify the enslavement here, because again, slavery didn't officially exist in English law.
Yeah.
I mean, there are also ideas about having to going against, enslaving Christians and things like that. But I honestly can't really answer the specifics about the Lockean question.
Just a hope. Lovely presentation, and now I've got a whole rabbit hole to climb down and wander around.
Yeah, I actually I want to look into that a little bit more myself.
Thank you.
Yep.
And there's a couple of other questions in the chat. Also, Denise, you have your hand up, so if you want to go ahead and.
Oh, I'd love to. Thanks for giving me the chance to ask a question. Wow, that was just really wonderful. Thank you for the presentation and all the great stuff. And I have tons of questions for you. And I'm going to try to actually just distill it into two.
All right.
And you can choose or ignore as you wish. But one of the things that I think a lot about, and I'm curious if you think about, is so what about the present day, right? There's this like past, and so what do we do? How does that inform where we are today and what we do today? And I'm thinking, what you were talking about reminded me of a few different things about today. One is, and again, I apologize that this, like, a whole bunch of thoughts came up as you were talking, and so pick and choose to what makes sense, but just about today. One of them is the doctrine of discovery and how that was used to justify the enslavement, pointing back to, the papal bulls, the statements made by the Pope in the 1400s that justified the enslavement and taking of land and things from people who were not Christians, and was then, codified in the US law by the Supreme Court in the 1800s, and still exists to this day, right? So it's under the doctrine of discovery that the federal government tried to revoke the nationality of the Wampanoag people just last year, which it looks like you don't know about that one, but and I'm not trying to like be a gotcha, but it's just the sort of things that it's this doctrine of discovery part that I feel like. So what about today, right? These feel like things that the Wampanoag, by the way, you probably know, but are the people who greeted the people who came off the Mayflower, right? So these are the first people, Indigenous people on this continent to in our mythology anyway, to greet the Europeans arriving here and forming this content. It's not, they're not really the first, but anyway. So that their sovereignty was attempted to be revoked under this idea that the indigenous people of this continent don't have the right to sovereignty, which remains to this day. So I feel, and I know that the Haudenosaunee just to the west of us have asked the Pope just 2 years ago, would you please revoke this? This feels really inhumane. And the Pope has so far neglected to do that. I mean, and so there's just so many other, many other like comment, we have the Hannah Duston statue, which you must be familiar with, in her relationship to the scalping laws. And I know some folks are trying to add some historical context, at least to that statue, where she's holding the scalps of kids, and she's a hero, and memorialized in a statue in Boscawen, I think it is, in New Hampshire. So anyway, just questioning what your thoughts are about restitution, if there's, how do we continue to reckon with this history today is really the question I have. The second question I have, which please choose either one, I'll ask the second one much more quickly, is I'm wondering if you know anything or ran across or can correct my understanding about the massacre of the Pemigewasset by Baker. I only know about a roadside marker up there in Plymouth, Plymouth, New Hampshire. I'm sorry, not Mass. Plymouth, New Hampshire. There's a rock with a plaque on it saying this happened, but I don't know if you were mentioning the historical record. I'm not sure if you know about that one.
I don't know about the one. And do you know when it happened?
I'll put it in the chat.
Okay.
It's just a roadside plaque. Like that's the whole historical record that I know about. So I was wondering if it's erected by some chapter of the Daughters of the American Revolution, oddly. Normally those aren't things they memorialize in roadside plaques, but they memorialized that one. So anyway, those two questions, I guess you answered the second one. I don't know if you want to comment on modern day, your thoughts about modern day restitution or reckoning.
I think that both kind of fall into the idea of erasing history or prioritizing the histories of different people over the histories of marginalized people. And I mean, I don't think we can necessarily draw a straight line from the present back to history, but it's easier, I think it's valuable to draw on the lessons that we can learn from history and apply them to the present. But I do think that generally the issue is with the way that I think that there needs to be a bit more education about Native Americans. And kind of their relationship to European colonists. And I think that would, if you reframe the relationship between American colonists and Native Americans, I think that you'll be able to, kind of discuss history in a more accurate, or at least a more meaningful way. So instead of thinking of maybe the Iroquois as pro-English, you can think of the English as pro-Iroquois or something like that. And then if you reframe it that way, I think that I don't know, I think it makes their history more powerful and maybe, I don't know, more accessible, and people will be more likely to learn about it. I don't know.
And there's a number of other questions in the question and answer. And just quickly, Denise, off the top of my head, as you know, too, in a lot of those court cases about Native sovereignty, history is used as a legal argument. So it is directly what happened in the past certainly shapes the world that we're living in now. The Haudenosaunee have used historical arguments in courts. The Lenapes have used successfully some of those arguments. So there really is a usable past to be seen here. Kind of hidden. I was wondering, there's a number of questions in there. Some of the attendees, Nick Germana had a question. I was wondering if we could unmute him. I'll just let him ask his. And there's some others that want to ask some questions.
Sure. Let me try to find him. There you are. And you should be able to unmute, Nick. And
yeah, can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, great. Tim, that was fantastic. Thank you. I enjoyed it very much. So I'm teaching a seminar this semester on nationalism, and I have several students who are doing American nationalism. And one of the things that I was thinking about is you were talking about the construction of American national identity and the definition of citizenship that is defined by whiteness in opposition to people of color. Do you think even before the revolutionary period, is there evidence that American context of British colonial subjects defining themselves in opposition to African slaves and Native Americans. Does that begin even before the Revolutionary period to shape a particular kind of either American identity in contrast to a British identity, or at very least begin to separate out an American British identity as opposed to a British identity? Because the forces that shaped British national identity were very, very different and took place in a context that didn't have those racial elements, right? And so for colonial British subjects to begin to think about themselves in such explicitly racial terms and in terms of whiteness seems to begin to depart from the basis of British identity across the Atlantic. So I didn't know, if you'd encountered that or what your thoughts are, if there was the beginning of a different American identity because of that racial component.
Right. I do think, and I think in where my analysis, where I address that is, I think it's in this idea of British law changing and being implemented in a different way in America. And it's interesting because towards, in the 1760s, 1770s, American law actually became more anglicized, and they took on a lot more elements, including, they're trying to be as British as they could. But in ingrained in that too, though, at the same time, were not just these ideas of class, but these ideas of race. So I think that you can see it occurring. It's kind of, I think it moves in parallel with this idea of they're trying to become, at least in Massachusetts, they're trying to become as British as possible in the legal field, at least. But you still see the implementation of British laws, but in American context with this racial identity. So I think that I don't know. I think it is more towards the 1760s and 1770s that you do start to see this American race identity being constructed in contrast to the British identity.
Thank you.
Yeah. Well, these are good questions, and I think it's a preview of my thesis defense.
Yeah, and Tim, you didn't have a chance to talk about it, but I know that it's part of your thesis that you address that question in terms, because we shouldn't give people the idea that the British Empire wasn't profoundly racist. It was. And you talk about how those ideas of race mixing with criminalizing the poor go back to Britain, right? After the revolution.
Yes, that's true.
So Andy Wilson had a couple of questions that he just wanted to ask. So if we could unmute him.
I think I'm unmuted. Am
You're
I?
unmuted?
You are.
Bingo. You are.
Okay. I will try to be brief. I have a series of short comments and a recommendation. First of all, Tim, excellent work. You're a bona fide historian, to be sure. And I think you did well to point out that just because one may be anti-slavery does not mean that person is anti-racist or non-racist, which is something I think people don't always keep in mind. In your talk, you said that the provenance of Thomas Power's confession isn't relevant, but I don't dismiss that completely, because if he was illiterate, the provenance of the confession, I think, is potentially important. It may not be knowable because his guilt or innocence is an issue in this. Because if he was illiterate and say he was tortured and he confessed to a crime he did not commit and somebody wrote the confession, then that's a form that further compounds the coercion and violence against Thomas Powers. So the guilt or innocence, I think at one point you said it doesn't matter. In a sense, it does matter. It's not central to what you're doing, but it does matter. And so it seems to me that the Thomas Powers case and the Thomas Powers execution, which is the presumed focus of your work, there's there's relatively little direct historical evidence connected to him and his alleged crime and his execution. So it seems to me that what you've done is try to take a contextualist approach. So you're placing Thomas Powers in a broader historical context, which is wonderful. But it seems to me that if you're going to do that, your topic is actually the broader topic, and Thomas Powers is the hook to lead you into that broader examination of racial violence in early New Hampshire. And that seems to me the book that will eventually come out of this, which is Race and American Identity in early New Hampshire. And the Thomas Powers case is the hook that leads you into that broader examination. Finally, if you're going to take that contextualist approach, I would just suggest, if you haven't already, read at least the first two parts of Michel Foucault's Discipline and Punish, where he addresses many of the issues you're addressing in the Thomas Powers case, especially in terms of the performance of the violence. He even has a chapter entitled The Spectacle of the Scaffold. And so that state-sanctioned violence and the signification of that seems to be central to what you're interested in, which is the sort of the signifying elements of the punishment. And Thomas Powers is an example of that. Mm-hmm. So I'll leave it at that. Just, you can think about this stuff if you want to, but first rate presentation, Tim. I continue. I was there at the beginning of your time at the graduate program. I was impressed then, and I am impressed today. So thank you very much for what you've done.
Those are very helpful comments, because it's funny. I actually did, when I first started writing about Thomas Powers, I did actually start using Foucault a little bit, but then I just kind of abandoned it back in fall of 2019. So it would be interesting to, if maybe not for my thesis, but kind of when I try to, make this publishable, to add elements of that to flesh it out a bit. And you were spot on too about Thomas Powers is a bit of the hook. So yeah, I'm still grappling with exactly how to completely, include him in a very meaningful way. So those are very helpful comments.
And Professor Warner just had a quick comment. Or a question. And how is it that what you've uncovered, how does what you've uncovered here in the 18th century compare with what you found last year when you wrote about scientific racism and the Civil War?
Well, what I talked about here had more to do with violence, and I guess it had to do with slavery too in the Civil War. But so this is more about violence in the law. When I was talking last semester, it was basically, for this paper, I didn't really talk about Enlightenment or scientific ideas from the Enlightenment, which were completely the foundation of my Civil War paper. Talking about measurements and how the flawed conclusions of scientific ideas, how that led to ideas of racial difference and racism. So my main idea in trying to shape my argument was arguing that these protean ideas of race that were present in the 1600s, that they began to be solidified over time. And you see that with New Hampshire, with racialization due to slavery and the law, and creating, or controlling the behavior of people of color. And then you also have to couple that with the racist violence. So the main difference, I guess, in short, is that I didn't include much Enlightenment scientific ideas in this, which actually maybe would be helpful in the latter part when I'm talking about the early Republic, in order to create, because they used these ideas in order to create justification for keeping people of color in a position of, in a less privileged position in northern societies.
And there's, I'll give you a moment to get a drink of water. There is another question that asks specifically, what did the purported testimony of Thomas Powers actually say?
Well, it basically, it started out, well, there are actually a few different versions of it. There are at least 3 different published versions. The one I analyzed mostly was from New Hampshire. He basically talks about childhood that he was born in Connecticut. He grew up throughout his childhood. Well, he was sexually active at a young age, but throughout his life too, he he had several. It's just a petty crime, stealing from his. I guess they were his masters, but it's still ambiguous whether or not he was enslaved or free. Then it talks about his moving to New Hampshire, where he ultimately does commit the rape, and the rest is about him kind of almost lamenting the fact that he's going to die, and he's scared, and he feels bad for what he did, and that he wants his soul to be by asking for forgiveness, he wants to be kind of forgiven for his transgressions. So yeah, I think that's a good general overview.
Greg, can I jump in with a question?
Absolutely.
Okay. Well, I have, and it's a very pedestrian question, actually. I've done a little archive research long time ago, and it was basically you go to a place and they bring out a box, and you go into the box and you pull stuff out, and you're just looking at it and reading it and hoping that something is interesting or relevant to what you're looking for. But I guess I'm wondering about the method and the actual research that you conducted. Were your sources digitized? Were they well sorted? Were they easily found and read? I could see some of this be tough to read, just thinking about it, or tough to understand as you're reading it. And, did you just have to sift lots of things until you got lucky and found things that were relevant? I talk a little bit about the research process because I'm really curious about it.
So in my specific case, I came across this broadside in fall of 2019, and I'd gone to New Hampshire Historical Society and just, basically what information do you have here about Black people or Indigenous people? So I found this broadside, and at the time I'd been reading a book by Marissa Fuentes called Dispossessed Live, and she's able to attempt to piece together people's lives from fragments in the archives and talk about the system of power that's in place. So I figured that that's kind of what I was going to do with the Powers case. So when it came time to write my thesis, I wanted to kind of bridge a gap between studies about Africans in the colonial Atlantic than Native Americans in the Atlantic world. So when that started, when I decided on that, I started doing more research to find out more about Native Americans. So it initially began because of COVID. My initial research for my thesis was mostly digitized, and there are a lot of good published collections of state and provincial papers of New Hampshire. There's a 40-volume set, which is really helpful. But during the summer, and because Brian Burford, it was a state archivist, he is part of the program, I was able to go to the archives during the summer. And again, because of Brian's help, he was able to find me, a box of documents that were they weren't organized or anything like that. So I was able to, go through just hundreds and hundreds of documents to try to find more about Thomas Powers in this case. So that was a really fun experience. But in general, it's been a mix of both digitized and physical copies. And it's been quite a good experience to be able to, go into the archives, see a document and realize that this could be important, but it's going to take me an hour to at least to try to transcribe this thing or try to get the general idea of what it's about. So it really gives you, it gave me quite a respect for historians who, the hundreds and hundreds of documents that they reference in their works. It's funny because that one of the main documents I use, the one about the murder of the St. Francis Native Americans, one of my classmates, he's actually transcribing, doing a project where he's transcribing 200 plus letters from that digitized collection here at Keene State. He's transcribing and digitizing them. So that would have been really helpful you know, when I first started this. So I'm looking forward to more about that. But it was quite an experience.
Yep. And I'm really pleased to hear you use the word fun. You know,
Yeah.
it's fun to get in there.
The research part is the fun part. The writing part is less so.
Yeah. And the subject matter is not necessarily fun.
Oh no, not by any means.
But-
No.
Yeah. So, well, Greg, if you know, if you want to continue, or it's right now is generally where we tend to sign off, or let the last few people stick around with one or two questions.
Yep.
Greg, do you
Yep,
want
this
to
is-
wrap up?
It's a good place to wrap up. I just wanted to make you aware, Tim, if you weren't already, there's a few things in the chat. I know we're recording this. Denise put some things in there for you as well. There was one comment about looking at other British colonies to look at how racialized law evolved there. Just want to make sure that you're aware of some of those helpful comments that might be in there.
Yeah, actually, that's Wes's comment about Canada. That's something I
Yep.
would actually like to at some point look farther north when I'm talking about this.